likewise an OBGYN sonologist. So your lecture for this afternoon is on diabetes mellitus in pregnancy. To start off, let me show you the objectives of this lecture. It is expected that at the end of the lecture, you would be able to review diabetes mellitus in pregnancy, be able to detect its various clinical presentations and possible differential diagnosis. Moreover, you should be able to appraise management strategies of diabetes mellitus in pregnancies, and furthermore, be able to assess associated adverse perinatal complications. To proceed, this will be the outline of our lecture. After the introduction, a brief classification, and then I'll start off with the pregestational diabetes, followed by gestational diabetes. The reference would be your Williams 26th ed. So, as an introduction, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in year 2020, nearly 27 million adults in the US have been diagnosed with diabetes. Another 7.3 million are suspected to be undiagnosed, and an estimated 88 million have prediabetes. Now, if you ask for local statistics, reported prevalence of GDM worldwide was apparently 7%. But it has different reports per region or per continent. In Europe, that would be about 5.4%. In Africa, it's said that it's 14%. In Asia, there's a wide range of prevalence between 0.7 to up to as high as 51%. In our region, Southeast Asia, the prevalence report is 10.1%. If you take a look at the local statistics from the Philippine Obstetrical and Gynecological Society, initial reports were 1.38%. But in a university report in Metro Manila, their report was up to as high as 29%. Interestingly, there were also publications on the Philippine data on postpartum diabetes. It was noted to be at 7.3%, and impaired glucose status after a GDM workup postpartum was 34%. Let's start off with poll question 1. What are the reasons for the substantial increase in incidence rate of diabetes worldwide? Is it A, because of an aging population more likely to develop type 2 diabetes? Or is it B, population growth within minority groups at particular risk? And C, a dramatic rise in obesity rates up to the epidemic type? Or D, all of the above? May I have your answers in the chat box? Did the monitor open the chat box? Okay. So the correct answer is D. So maybe before I proceed with the lecture, I'd just like to remind the students that I've already submitted the exam questions for this particular topic. And just listen to the lecture and note the highlighted aspects of this presentation. So to continue, what are the reasons for the substantial increased rates? Well, yes, one, it's aging population, which is more likely to develop the type 2 diabetes. The population growth within minority groups at particular risk for type 2 diabetes. Note that in the local guidelines, Filipinos, Southeast Asian pregnant women are at higher risk for GDM. Note also that there's a dramatic rise in obesity rates. Almost 3 in 10 women were considered obese prior to becoming pregnant. And there's likewise strong relationship between diabetes and the current obesity epidemic in the US. There's critical need for diet and lifestyle interventions so that we can change this trajectory growth. I'd like to introduce you the previous classification of diabetes mellitus according to the American Diabetes Association. You have type 1, type 2, and gestational diabetes. Prior to that, we had the modified White classification, Class A and Class B. Class A would be your gestational diabetes or onset of diabetes during pregnancy, and the other classes were according to associated pathology or vascular disease at that. So until the mid-1990s, the White classification, previously recommended by the ACOG for diabetic pregnant women, was the linchpin of management. Today, the White classification is useless. but it still provides simple, useful information on pregnancy risk and likewise its prognostication. The ACOG 2019 no longer recommends the white classification, as the current focus is whether diabetes antedates pregnancy or if it were first diagnosed during pregnancy. So this is the proposed classification of diabetes of the American Diabetes Association. One is if diabetes was diagnosed during pregnancy and it is not clearly overt, neither the type 1 or type 2. That is gestational diabetes. And then you have your type 1 diabetes, diabetes resulting from beta cell destruction, usually leading to absolute insulin deficiency. And you have your type 2 diabetes from inadequate insulin secretion in the face of increased insulin resistance. Let's start off with pregestational diabetes. Poll question 2. Which of the following is the diagnosis for women with random plasma sugar of more than 200 with classic signs and symptoms such as polydipsia, polyuria, and unexplained weight loss, those with a fasting glucose of more than 125, or those with a first trimester HbA1c level of more than or equal to 6.5%? Is it A, diabetic ketoacidosis, B, gestational diabetes mellitus, C, impaired glucose tolerance, or D, overt diabetes? All right, good. So the answer is D, overt diabetes. There is no diagnostic challenge if a woman would present with high plasma glucose, glucosuria, and ketoacidosis. Note this following statement. According to the ADA and the WHO, you consider overt diabetes that is first detected in pregnancy if you have a random plasma glucose of more than 200 with classic signs and symptoms such as polydipsia, polyuria, and unexplained weight loss. When the fasting glucose is more than 125, when the first trimester HbA1c or glycosylated hemoglobin is more than or equal to 6.5%, or when a 2-hour 75-gram OGTT shows a level of more than 200. So this table shows you the diagnosis of overt diabetes in pregnancy according to the IAD-PSG consensus panel in 2010. So, diagnosis. Presumed diagnosis of overt diabetes in pregnancy is based on these thresholds, and this should be confirmed postpartum. Now, we have risk factors for impaired carbohydrate metabolism in pregnant women. So, what are these risk factors? You have 1, strong family history of diabetes. 2, when you review history, there's previous delivery of a large newborn, when there's persistent glucosuria in the laboratories, and when there is unexplained fetal losses. What are the harms in pregnancy? Serious complications to the embryo, the fetus, and the mother are directly attributable to diabetes. This may be prevented with improved glycemic control during pre-conceptional care. Note, glycemic control throughout pregnancy and a late pregnancy level of HbA1c less than 6.5% will lead to reduced rates of adverse obstetric and likewise adverse neonatal outcomes. With overt diabetes, adverse outcomes are not simply related to glucose control, but more importantly, because there's also a degree of underlying cardiovascular and sometimes renal disease. Tabulated here are as follows. 1, on your left, you have maternal and perinatal outcomes in women with GDM and overt DM. Maternal would be chronic hypertension, renal disease, gestational hypertension, chorioamnionitis, cesarean birth. For the neonates, you have your RDS or your respiratory distress syndrome, ventilation concerns, NICU admission, macrosomia, and even death. Tabulated on your right would be the selected congenital malformations in pregnancies complicated by overt DM. The most common of which would be cardiovascular concerns, the most common of which would be your AV septal defect. Other concerns would be neural tube defects, where you have your anencephaly, encephalocele, hydrocephaly, cleft palate, esophageal abnormalities, hypospadias, renal and sacral agenesis. What about fetal effects? One would be spontaneous abortion. Up to 25% of overt DM have an early miscarriage. Increased miscarriage rate is associated when your HbA1c is more than 12% or if your preprandial glucose is more than 120. Outcomes are also prone to preterm delivery. Overt DM is an undisputed risk factor for preterm delivery. 20% of women with DM would deliver preterm. More than 60% are indicated preterm births, and this is due to obstetrical or sometimes medical complications. You see, more than 37% of women with diabetes would also have chronic hypertension, and this would usually be the indication for the preterm delivery. These babies are prone to malformations. Incidence is up to 11%. That is double the rate than non-diabetic mothers. They constitute about 50% of perinatal deaths in diabetic pregnancies. Note, cardiovascular malformations account for more than 50% of the anomalies. It is usually attributed to poorly controlled diabetes, both preconceptionally and even early in pregnancy. So, what is the etiology? They say this is secondary to excess production of toxic superoxide radicals, altered cell signaling pathways, upregulation of some genes by hyperglycemia, and activation of programmed cell death. Outcomes are also prone to altered fetal growth. Diminished fetal growth may result from congenital malformation or from substrate deprivation due to advanced maternal vascular disease that complicated the diabetes. Fetal overgrowth, though, is more typical. Maternal hyperglycemia would prompt fetal hyperinsulinemia, which in turn stimulates excessive somatic growth. Note, excessive fat deposition on the shoulders and the trunk will predispose these fetuses to shoulder dystocia or fetal-pelvic disproportion during labor. The incidence of macrosomia rises significantly when mean blood glucose concentrations chronically exist more than 130 milligram per deciliter. For pregestational diabetes, pregnancies would usually have unexplained fetal demise. The risk of fetal demise is 3 times to 4 times higher. They say unexplained because common factors such as obvious placental insufficiency, placental abruption, fetal growth restriction, or oligohydramnios are not usually identified. Typically, these babies would be LGA or large for gestational age. They die before labor. Then the IUFD or the intrauterine fetal demise is usually prone later in the third trimester. This condition is associated with poor glycemic control, advanced diabetes, maternal ketoacidosis, severe preeclampsia with placental insufficiency, and other vascular complications. What is their hypothesis to the unexplained fetal demise? They say that hyperglycemic mediated chronic aberrations in oxygen and fetal metabolite support would be the cause. There's increase for the lactic acid levels, so they are rendered acidotic with decreased umbilical cord pH, also on the acidotic side. They're more prone to hydramnios, or what we call your polyhydramnios. In the third trimester, that's excess amniotic fluid measured in 4-quadrant amniotic fluid index of more than 24 centimeters. It is associated with poor glycemic control. They say it has elevated HbA1c. So what is the hypothesis behind polyhydramnios? Although unproven, it is said that fetal hyperglycemia causes polyuria. A study shows that the amniotic fluid index parallels amniotic fluid glucose in diabetic women. How about neonatal effects? There's risk of unexplained stillbirth, as mentioned earlier. Neonatal morbidity is increased due to immaturity or the preterm delivery that has been prompted by advanced diabetes or by complications of preeclampsia. There's greater risk for NEC or your necrotizing enterocolitis, and likewise late onset sepsis. They're also prone to RDS or your respiratory distress syndrome. Gestational age, rather than the overt diabetes, is likely the most significant factor associated with RDS. Diabetes does not appear to alter the beneficial effects of antenatal corticosteroids to hasten lung maturity. The babies on delivery are prone to hypoglycemia. Note that upon delivery, there is rapid drop in plasma glucose concentrations at sometimes levels less than 45. This is attributed to the hyperplasia of the fetal beta islet cells that is induced by chronic maternal hyperglycemia, common if mother has unstable glucose concentration or if the mother has been exposed to antenatal corticosteroids during labor, therefore increasing her levels of glucose as well. Babies are prone to hypocalcemia. Serum calcium concentrations are less than 8, and this may be due to the altered magnesium calcium economy, asphyxia, and preterm birth. The babies are also prone to hyperbilirubinemia and polycythemia. A major contributing factor is newborn polycythemia, which raises bilirubin load. Polycythemia is a fetal response to the relative hypoxia that happened in utero. Fetal hypoxia is due to hyperglycemia-mediated elevations in the maternal affinity for oxygen and fetal oxygen consumption. Hypoxia and insulin-like growth factors would lead to increased erythropoietin levels and likewise red cell production. Babies are also prone to cardiomyopathy. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is associated with cardiac dysfunction. Pathological ventricular hypertrophy due to insulin excess has been noted. This may lead to obstructive cardiac failure. Evident fetal diastolic dysfunction, even in the first trimester, were also noted. By third trimester, there is thicker interventricular septum and right ventricular wall. Most newborns are asymptomatic, and hypertrophy usually resolves months after delivery. There can also be long-term cognitive development. Please take note that recent studies have shown that intrauterine metabolic conditions are linked to neurodevelopment in the offspring. Intelligence quotient average 1 to 2 points lower. Autism spectrum disorder or developmental delay are usually common, and there's been note of diminished cognitive and language development. How about questions on inheritance? The risk of developing type 1 DM, if either parent is affected, is about 3 to 5%. The risk of developing the type 2 diabetes, if both parents are affected, would be 40%. So we consider genetic factors and environmental factors such as infection, diet, and toxins that bring about adverse fetal effects as well. Let's have poll question number 3. Which of the following diabetic conditions are possibly affected by pregnancy in its long-term course? Would it be A, nephropathy, B, neuropathy, C, retinopathy, or D, all of the above? So we have C, C. Okay, good. And the answer is C, retinopathy. So as to maternal effects, except for retinopathy, the long-term course of diabetes does not appear to be affected by pregnancy. Maternal death is uncommon, but rates in women with diabetes are still higher than unaffected gravidas. So the deaths, if ever they would occur, would be secondary to diabetic ketoacidosis, hypoglycemia, hypertension, and infection. Maternal effects. Please note the following. One would be preeclampsia. Preeclampsia most often forces preterm delivery among diabetic women. They most exhibit pre-existing vascular complications and nephropathy. So what is the recommendation? Should you have a patient high risk for diabetes and hypertension? Low-dose aspirin prophylaxis is recommended in women at high risk for development of preeclampsia, and that would also include women who have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Moreover, we can discuss diabetic nephropathy. This is detectable nephropathy, which begins in microalbuminuria. then proceeds to having macroalbuminuria that develops in those destined to have ESRD or your end-stage renal disease. Hypertension invariably develops during this period. Also, hypertension or substantial proteinuria before or during pregnancy is also a major predictor of progression to renal failure. Diabetic retinopathy. Now, 14% of those with pre-pregnancy retinopathy develop progression of disease. The following have been associated with disease progression: when there's hypertension, higher levels of insulin-like growth factor, higher levels of placental growth factor, when there is macular edema. So what is the recommendation? The recommendation is for pregnant women with overt diabetes should be offered retinal assessment after the first prenatal visit, and then subsequent eye examination will depend on the severity of retinopathy and the level of glucose control. There are also concerns on diabetic neuropathy. It is diabetic gastropathy which causes the nausea and vomiting, nutritional problems, and difficult glucose control. This is associated with high risk of morbidity and poor perinatal outcome. So how do we assess or treat your gastropathy? You can give your metoclopramide or dopamine D2 receptor agonists. These patients are also prone to diabetic ketoacidosis. They may develop with excessive vomiting or your hyperemesis gravidarum when there is an infection, when there is non-compliance with insulin treatment, and when their insulin pump failures. Infection. Rates of many infections are higher in diabetic pregnant women. The most common of these infections would be, such as in the photo on your right, would be Candida vulvovaginitis, bacterial urinary, and likewise respiratory tract infections, and even puerperal pelvic sepsis. Let's give you poll question number 4. In preconception care, which of the following shows optimal glycemic control among diabetic women on insulin? Is it A, glycosylated hemoglobin levels of less than 6.5%, B, preprandial glucose ranging between 70 to 100, C, peak 2-hour postprandial glucose 100 to 120 milligram per deciliter in measurement, or D, all of the above? May have your answers. A, answers are coming in. Most of you answered D. And the correct answer is D, all of the above. So please take note of the following preconceptional care. As to optimal glycemic control before conception, it should be HbA1c levels less than 6.5%. As to optimal glycemic control for those who are put on insulin, preprandial glucose should range between 70 to 100. The peak 2-hour postprandial glucose, which is measured 2 hours after the first bite, should be between 100 to 120, and the mean daily glucose concentration should be less than 110. The recommendations: we treat diabetic complications, retinopathy or nephropathy before pregnancy. And for these patients, we also give your folate, 400 micrograms per day orally in the periconception period and even during the early pregnancy. And this is to decrease the risk of having your NTDs or your neural tube defects. In the first trimester care, we do careful monitoring of glucose control. That is indeed essential. We assess the extent of diabetic complications by checking the 24-hour urine protein excretion, the serum creatinine levels, of course, as mentioned earlier, check the retina, facilitate an echocardiogram, more so if they have chronic hypertension. Must precisely establish the gestational age so that if we have concerns on preterm delivery, you're confident with your aging. And we carry a first trimester screening for aneuploidy. That would cover pregnancy-associated plasma protein A detection, beta human chorionic gonadotropin or your beta HCG, and a measurement of your nuchal translucency. So this is done between 11 weeks to 13 weeks and 6 days maximum. So this one, you can also request for an NIPT or a non-invasive prenatal testing detecting cell-free DNA. How about insulin treatment? In the gravida, overt diabetes is best treated with insulin. Oral hypoglycemic agents have been used successfully for GDM, but currently are not recommended for overt DM. Maternal glycemic control can be achieved with multiple daily insulin injections and the adjustment, of course, of the diet. Subcutaneous insulin infusion by a calibrated pump does not yield better pregnancy outcomes. We rarely used it during pregnancy. As to monitoring, we conduct self-monitoring of capillary glucose levels or your CBG check using a glucometer. As to diet, nutritional planning for appropriate weight gain through carbohydrate and caloric modification should be facilitated. As to diet, nutritional planning for appropriate weight gain through carbohydrate and caloric modification is carried out. It will be a mix of carbohydrates, protein, and fat. A minimum of 175 grams per day of carbohydrate should be distributed in 3 small to moderate sized meals with 2 to 4 snacks in between. The ideal dietary composition would be 55% carbohydrates, 20% protein, and 25% fat, of which less than 10% should be saturated fat. Weight loss is not recommended during pregnancy, but modest caloric restriction may be appropriate, more so for women who are overweight or obese. Insulin treatment and hypoglycemia. The incidence peaks during the first trimester. That is why caution is recommended when attempting to achieve euglycemia or normal glucose control in women with recurrent episodes of hypoglycemia. Loose glycemic control, meaning having episodes of FBS more than 120, is associated with greater risks for preeclampsia, a cesarean delivery, and birth weights more than the 90th percentile compared to those who have moderate to tight control. On the other hand, very tight control, when your FBS is always less than 95, you see that there would be no obvious benefits, but the number of hypoglycemia episodes will increase. In the second trimester, to detect neural tube defects and other anomalies, we can request for a serum alpha protein determination between 16 to 20 weeks gestation, together with a targeted ultrasound evaluation or a congenital anomaly scan. To some, we also request for a fetal echocardiography due to the 5-fold increase in congenital cardiac anomalies. Now, as to second trimester glucose control, normoglycemia with self-monitoring of the CPGs is also the goal. This is followed by higher insulin requirements due to enhanced peripheral resistance to insulin related to pregnancy and the pregnancy hormones. In the third trimester, there is a threat of late pregnancy stillbirth. So fetal surveillance protocols are put into place, like advising fetal movement or fetal kick counts, periodic heart rate monitoring, doing your non-stress tests, intermittent biophysical profile or your BPS evaluation, and even a contraction stress test. According to the ACOG, we initiate testing at 32 to 34 weeks gestation, and if with reassuring testing and no other complications, delivery is anticipated between 39 weeks to 39 weeks and 6 days. For vaginal delivery, labor induction may be attempted when the fetus is not excessively large and the cervix is considered favorable. Now, as to insulin use, we reduce or withhold the dose of the long-acting insulin on the day of delivery. Regular insulin will meet most of or all of the insulin needs of the mother, and we just do your capillary or plasma glucose check levels during the active labor. In the puerperium, many diabetic women may require virtually no insulin for the first 24 hours or more postpartum. Subsequently, insulin requirements may fluctuate. Infection must be promptly detected and treated, and when appropriate, oral agents may be restarted. Now, counseling should include birth control because effective contraception would allow optimal glucose control before a subsequent conception. So let's now go to gestational diabetes. Poll question 5. One or more of these values from the 75-gram OGTT must be equaled or exceeded for the diagnosis of gestational diabetes mellitus. So, which of the following is the correct glucose concentration threshold according to the IAD PSG? Is it A, fasting of 92, 1 hour of 180, or 2 hours of 153? Is it B, 95, 180, and 155? Is it C, 105, 190, and 165? Or D, none of the above? So what is our cutoff threshold? No guesses. We have A, C, okay. And the correct answer is A. So you just master this cutoff numbers, 92, 180, and 153. So screening and diagnosis. So first, what is the definition of gestational diabetes? This is carbohydrate intolerance of variable severity with its onset or the first detection during pregnancy. It emphasizes the need for enhanced surveillance during pregnancy and, of course, for future testing postpartum. Most important perinatal outcome for GDM would be excessive fetal growth that may result both in maternal and fetal birth trauma. The likelihood of fetal death with appropriately treated GDM is not different from that of the general population. More than 50% of the GDM women would ultimately develop overt DM in the ensuing 20 years. And note the long range complications would include obesity and even diabetes in the offspring. So, I'd like to share with you how it came about, our current guidelines, but in other countries, they practice screening. This is from the IAD. We had several groups. We had the IAD PSG consensus panel, the changes in guidelines, which came off from the HAPO trial. We have the American Diabetes Association, and those group who would advocate a single-step approach or assessing glucose values following a 75 oral glucose challenge test. So changes happened after the HAPO study was published. This was a 7-year international epidemiological study of 23,325 pregnant women covering 15 centers in 9 countries, analyzing the association of various levels of glucose intolerance during the third trimester and the adverse perinatal outcomes. So results showed increasing plasma glucose levels were associated with increasing adverse outcomes. So they reformulated or made a new recommendation for the cutoffs. That would be fasting of 92, 1 hour of 180, and 2 hour cutoff of 153. So when they said screening, the NIH consensus concluded that evidence is insufficient to just adopt a one-step approach. That's why they had a two-step approach, starting off with a 50-gram oral glucose challenge test or your OGCT, and this is just a 1 hour oral glucose test. This is the 5th International Workshop Conference on Diabetes, and they recommended the following screening strategy. They assessed these patients if they were low risk, average risk, or high risk. If low risk, blood testing is not routinely required. But if they were average risk, they do the two-step approach, a 50-gram oral glucose challenge test at 24 to 28 weeks. And if this is abnormal, they proceed with a 100-gram OGTT. According to the ACOG, they started off with a 50-gram oral glucose challenge test, carried out between 24 to 28 weeks age of gestation. However, there were varied cutoffs. Some would say 130, some would say 135, some would say 140. In the local practice, before we started off with just the one-step screening, we used the 130 cutoff for the 50-gram OGCT. So these were the previous cutoffs used. The most popular, which was recommended initially, was the Carpenter and Custan, a cutoff of 95, 180, and 155, pretty similar to the current recommendations. As to gestational diabetes, we have maternal and fetal effects. Adverse consequences of GDM differ from that of pre-gestational DM. GDM women do not have fetuses with substantially higher rates of anomalies or congenital abnormalities compared to the general population. Similar to women with overt diabetes, though, there is association with higher frequency of hypertension and also cesarean delivery. Women with elevated plasma glucose levels have elevated rates of unexplained stillbirth, similar also to those with overt DM. Let's talk about fetal macrosomia. The perinatal goal is to avoid difficult delivery from macrosomic babies and concomitant birth trauma that would be associated with shoulder dystocia. This happens because there is excessive shoulder and trunk fat that commonly characterizes the macrosomic baby of a diabetic mother, and this predisposes these neonates to shoulder dystocia and eventually a cesarean delivery to some. Factors that can be implicated or causing fetal macrosomia would include insulin-like growth factors, cord serum C-peptide levels, and epidermal growth factor. Maternal body mass index or the BMI is an independent and more substantial risk factor for fetal macrosomia than is glucose intolerance. Highest fraction of LGA neonates were attributable to maternal obesity plus excessive gestational weight gain. Weight distribution, greater maternal truncal obesity have greater risk for GDM. Increased maternal abdominal subcutaneous fat thickness come 18 to 22 weeks gestation is also correlated with BMI and was also a better predictor of GDM. How about fetal effects? Again, there is neonatal hypoglycemia. Hyperinsulinemia may provoke severe neonatal hypoglycemia, and the recommended clinical threshold would be between 35 to 40. The risk for neonatal hypoglycemia correlates with umbilical cord C-peptide levels as determined in the HAPO trial. The risk rises with birth weight independent of a maternal diabetes diagnosis. Okay, so let us have poll question number 6. Which of the following conditions decreased in incidence when gestational diabetes mellitus is treated? Would it be A, preeclampsia, B, shoulder dystocia, C, fetal macrosomia, or D, all of the above? Okay, very good. So the answer would be D, all of the above. So how do we manage GDM? As to pharmacological methods, this would only be recommended should diet modification and lifestyle changes fail. When the fasting blood glucose should be less than 95 and the 2-hour postprandial plasma glucose should be less than 120. Treating GDM resulted in significantly lower incidence of preeclampsia, shoulder dystocia, and fetal macrosomia. As to diet, nutritional instructions generally include carbohydrate-controlled diet sufficient to maintain normal glycemia and avoiding ketoacidosis. Caloric intake of between 30 to 35 kilocalories per kilogram per day. According to ACOG, carbohydrates of 33 to 40%, protein of 20%, and fat of 40%. Exercise. ACOG 2020 recommends regular physical activity that would incorporate aerobic and strength conditioning exercises. Structured exercise programs during pregnancy can reduce the risk of developing GDM. Exercise in women with GDM also lowers glucose level. Note, however, that women who do not exercise prior to pregnancy are not usually prescribed to venture into new and strenuous exercise during the course of pregnancy. How about glucose monitoring? Women using daily blood glucose self-monitoring or the self-check had significantly fewer macrosomic newborns and they gained less weight after the diagnosis. According to the ACOG and the ADA, they recommend the CBG checking 4 times daily. One would be fasting and the other would be either a 1 hour, a 2 hour after meal. So management, let's take a look at insulin treatment. Insulin treatment is the standard therapy when target glucose levels cannot be consistently achieved solely on nutrition and exercise. Note that insulin does not cross the placenta. Tight glycemic control can be achieved. So if it is not achieved, then insulin treatment is recommended. More so when your fasting blood sugar is more than 95, the 1 hour check is more than 140, and the 2 hour check is more than 120. So how do we start insulin? We start it at a dose of zero point 0.7 to 1 unit per kilogram per day, divided in 3 to 4 doses in a day. There's combination of intermediate acting and short acting insulin, and this can be used and adjusted accordingly. We also have your oral hypoglycemic agents. However, insulin is still the preferred first-line agent for persistent hyperglycemia in women with GDM. The ACOG and the ADA, they acknowledge several studies that support the safety and efficacy of either your metformin or glyburide. However, take note that your glyburide crosses the placenta and reaches fetal concentrations that are more than two-thirds that of maternal levels. Glyburide is associated with higher birth weight, more macrosomia, and more frequent neonatal hypoglycemia, with significant rise in NICU admissions and RDS in these babies. On the other hand, metformin reaches fetal serum concentrations just equal to the maternal levels. Metformin is associated with less maternal weight gain, lower birth weight, less macrosomia, and less severe neonatal hypoglycemia. So, for both glyburide and metformin, there is no FDA approval for treatment of GDM as long-term outcomes have not yet been fully studied. But the ACOG recognizes both as reasonable choices as second-line glycemic control, but they recommend full disclosure of the limitations in current safety data. So for those patients who have poor compliance to insulin injections, they cannot do their insulin injections, or there are complications in their insulin injections, then we entertain the use of oral hypoglycemic agents. But before you prescribe your oral hypoglycemic agents, there should be informed consent about outcomes and incomplete safety study data. That's one. And there are also some patients who've been previously started off on metformin, and they are just continued on metformin on determination of diabetes during pregnancy. Now, obstetrical management. GDM women who are diet treated and do not require insulin, early delivery, or other interventions are seldom required. They're managed expectantly. Elective labor induction can be done to prevent shoulder dystocia, but this issue remains controversial. The ACOG recommends that routine labor induction should not occur before 39 weeks. The ACOG acknowledges that you can do prophylactic cesarean delivery when a diabetic woman has an estimated fetal weight of more than 4,500 grams. Take note, the ACOG 2019 recommends either a fasting blood glucose assessment or a 75-gram 2-hour OGTT between 4 to 12 weeks postpartum for the diagnosis of overt diabetes. ADA 2019 recommends testing every 1 to 3 years for women with history of GDM but normal postpartum glucose screening. Women with history of GDM are also at risk for cardiovascular complications associated with dyslipidemia, hypertension, and abdominal obesity. This is what you call your metabolic syndrome. Tabulated here would be the 5th International Workshop Conference. Here, they recommend between 6 to 12 weeks. Postpartum check with a 75-gram OGTT. How about concerns on recurrence? Pooled recurrence rate is 48%. So that's almost double. Additional risk factors for GDM recurrence would be elevated maternal BMI, insulin use, fetal macrosomia, weight gain between pregnancies. So how do we prevent the recurrence? Where there should be lifestyle behavioral changes, weight control, and maybe, of course, recommend exercise between pregnancies. So with that, we've covered both your pre-gestational diabetes and your gestational diabetes mellitus. Do we have questions from the audience? Any questions? So I've pretty much outlined what is in the textbook and organized them into series that would be similar your pre-gestational and your gestational diabetes. Time check is 1:45. If you don't have any questions with regards to the lecture, I'll let you go and I wish you luck for the upcoming OB exams. Thank you.